This is the Wrap on Aging, and I'm Rob Ence, your host with the Utah Commission on Aging, broadcasting from Scope Radio. The Wrap on Aging explains public policy, education, and research that informs and empowers Utah's older adults, and it connects you and your family to important resources and services. Kevin David Mitnick was born in 1963 in California. By age 13, he had exhibited skills that would lead him to become America's most wanted hacker. After his high-profile arrest in 1995 at the age of 32, he served 5 years in prison for various computer and communications-related crimes. He is now a computer security consultant and author. His book, The Art of Invisibility, is a sobering review of the many ways we can be compromised through technology and serves as a wake-up call for those of us who may be lulled into a false sense of security. The foreword to that book was penned by Finnish international security expert and lecturer Mikko Hipponen, wherein he recounts a conversation with a friend. He states, "I explained how I'd spent the past 25 years working with Internet security and privacy. My friend let out a chuckle when I mentioned online privacy. His friend said, 'Well, that sounds all fine and dandy, but I'm not really worried. After all, I'm not a criminal, and I'm not doing anything bad. I don't care if somebody looks at what I'm doing online.'" Hipponen goes on to say, "Listening to my friend made me sad. Here's what I believe. You may not have anything to hide, but you have everything to protect." Today, we are talking about the role of technology in our society, specifically our use of the Internet and cell phones. We will explore security and privacy threatened by cybercriminals, how it can happen, and what we can do to protect ourselves and our information while enjoying the benefits these technologies offer. Our guests today are Chris Burbank in studio and Debbie White online. Burbank is the former Salt Lake City police chief and is now a vice president with the Center for Policing Equity, a national consulting organization dedicated towards building goodwill and trust between law enforcement and the public. Debbie White is an educator and artist who has more than 30 years of teaching experience, ranging from grade school to college courses offered at the University of Utah's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. Her interests cover the use of secure technology and creative applications. Debbie and Chris, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having us. Thank you, Rob.
We are the generation that went online. Tools intended to connect us can also isolate us and make us vulnerable. The promise of technology may at times be at odds with the reality of technology. So, first of all, Debbie, why do we need technology?
Well, for a lot of things, it makes our lives simpler in many ways. It connects us, and it's actually making our world smaller, so we're getting a lot of information quicker. The sky's kind of the limit on what technology can benefit us with.
So, Chris, how are ways in which you personally use technology that you maybe did not use 10 years ago?
Wow, where do I begin? It covers everything from when I book a hotel to when I travel, which I do quite extensively now. When I'm looking for the hotel, when I get to whatever city it is, I'm always using Google. I'm using banking applications, my credit card. Pretty much just about anything I can is now online.
That's correct. You know, we're finding our keys where our phone was left behind. We pay for our rides through Uber and Lyft and organizations like that. I find one of our biggest struggles is we set the lawn watering schedule, and then it anticipates moisture in the air and shuts it off even when we don't want it to.
That's even more advanced in my home.
Well, there are ways, that we are yet to discover. I'm going to ask you, Debbie, what are some things you think might be coming down the road in which we might use technology in our homes and our everyday lives?
It's one of those things that I don't even think we can imagine, because when I taught my sixth graders, it was one of those things that I knew that they would be using computers and they would have jobs within computers, but had no idea to the degree that we have the use of technology out there. So, I mean, if our whole entire house is being controlled by a computer, it could get to the point of like Terminator, not going down the bad part totally, but it is one of those things that it's totally open as to things that we can't possibly imagine, because so far things that we have created just wasn't in the grand scheme of things years ago.
Well, you've just put a fearful image in all of our minds with the Terminator, so...
I'm sorry.
No, it's all right.
We should just note that was not the former police chief, all right? That was an educator.
That's this Miss Citizen out there. For all its considerable benefits, many argue that technology has been instrumental in eroding our security, our privacy, and our community. Yet here we are today at this studio using technology to create a public event, educational content, making it accessible through various media devices, and conducting a conversation remotely. Let's talk a little bit about cybercrime or computer-oriented crime, crimes that involve a computer and a network. The computer may have been used in the commission of a crime, or it may be the target. Cybercrimes have been defined as offenses that are committed against individuals or groups of individuals with a criminal motive to intentionally harm them. Chris, how bad is it?
Well, I personally think this is probably one of the most underreported crimes that we have in the country. We really don't have a good idea of how much goes on. And then the other thing that is very fascinating, and it's human nature, what you see on the 10 o'clock news is not the latest scam or the internet trick that is fooling thousands or hundreds of thousands of people. But no, it's the violent crime. It's the thing that reaches out and touches us, and we all want to see that and be involved in that. But when you look at a dollar or cost to society amount, I would dare say that cybercrime and crime that is committed through the internet or with the use of some sort of computer device far outweighs all other crime put together. And yet it's not our focus, and it's not one that, if you ask the American public, is on the top of their mind.
It's like Mitnick's book entitled The Art of Invisibility.
Oh, without question.
It's what's going on that we can't see that can be even more devastating than the things that are reported, is what you're suggesting.
Oh, without question. And the other thing that's very hard about this is, especially in the population that we're kind of discussing today, when you look at elderly people, you don't want to let people know that you've been scammed. And so low dollar amounts over large numbers of people go almost undetected. And that's a very scary thing, because I don't want people to know that I was gullible on the internet or when someone called. And so a lot of times we kind of hide that away. And so, again, that helps to create that underreporting that happens.
There's a personal embarrassment that we have to deal with. And that's why when it's reported to some of the consumer agencies nationally, they estimate a range of $3 to $36 billion a year, because 3 is the low end of what we might know. 36 billion is what possibly is happening, and there's some good evidence to support that. We have a better way of determining losses to banks and so on, but the same range of how many adults are impacted could be as high as 1 in 5 individuals. And clearly, you made a very important point. This is underreported stuff, way underreported. Well, go ahead, Deb.
And I also think that it's reported with other crimes. So it's not something that's directly reported that it was computer related or a scam related, that it's kind of reported with other, like a break-in to someone's home, versus the fact that the focus was getting at the computer and that type of, crime out there.
We're hopeful that by the end of our conversation today, that not only will we alert individuals to the challenges and the things they need to do, but that it's okay to acknowledge a mistake and how important it is to step up and report these things so that we can aid law enforcement in building the protections for the future.
Well, and it's when we work together, not to interrupt you, but when we work together, that's how we actually defeat these sort of things, right? When it's underground and it's hidden, criminals thrive. And when we as the public say, no, we're not going to tolerate that, we're going to step up, right? We're going to let people know, we're going to inform other people, and we're going to share our life experience. Then the focus is on the criminals. And when the spotlight shines on them, they move on.
Excellent. So one of the things that is devastating to society that oftentimes isn't measured besides financial loss is the impact that this has emotionally and physically on individuals who have been defrauded. And there is a statistic that indicates that people will die at 3 times the normal death rate faster if they have been a victim of crime or fraud. You are listening to the Wrap on Aging podcast from Scope Radio. I'm your host, Rob Ence, with the Utah Commission on Aging, and we are talking about Internet and technology security. Our guests are Debbie White, an Internet security educator, and Chris Burbank, a law enforcement expert. Well, by now, most of us are familiar with the terms hacker and cybercrime, terms for scams and frauds and the criminals who have weaponized the Internet and cell phone technology, all intended to separate you from your money and your privacy. So, asking our listeners, as well as Debbie and Chris, who's ever received a phone call from an IRS agent, so to speak? Who has had that bill collector call that is asking for money before they shut utilities off on a bill that you don't think is due? Or sweepstakes winners? Debbie, talk to us a little bit about an incident or two you've discovered in your coursework that will illustrate the kinds of schemes that are currently in play.
One of the most frequent are the ones in which people are getting emails indicating that they need to verify their account information, whether it's a credit card account, bank card account, whether it is an email account, and it sends you to a link of someplace that looks like it could be the real page, but it isn't. And then it's asking for all of that information, whether it's the account, the password, and so on. And what that's doing is actually collecting that information. And I actually, in my last class, had someone that did that with their email account. Fortunately, it was only with an email account and not with a credit card account. But that's the type of thing in which I tell people, go directly to, if you've got a question about it, go directly to that credit card company. Don't click on those links in an email.
So everybody who has a bank account or a credit card account, they always will have a customer service number that they can trust and rely on, and that should be their go-to to verify whether there's a legitimate concern about information, correct?
Exactly, because your bank account and your credit card accounts are not going to be asking you to re-verify something. And if they do, they have more legitimate ways to do it. And it usually is the two-step authentication factor, which usually occurs as well. So you know that you're actually going into a secure site.
So there are other indicators on an email that might tip off that it's fraudulent. If someone looked at an email, what are some of the things in that email that they might take a look at to determine whether this is a legitimate request or not?
They're often trying to make something immediate and where you have to react right away. And it would be the thing that is, we've reset something for you, or we want verification of. And those are some of the key words. It'll be coming from, you might have a different email account that is, if it's American Express, it's americanexpress@gmail.com. It's like, well, that's not going to happen. So you've got to look at the return email addresses, where something is coming from. But usually the key to that is don't ever click on those emails. Go to your go-to numbers, whether it's the email address or the phone number, and verify it that way. I mean, I even had an American Express thing came through about a year and a half ago, called American Express. They said, no, they never sent it. They had me forward it to them so they can see where the scammer was coming from. Not that it's easy to track down, but it happens all the time. That's probably one of the most frequent ones I hear about.
So what's clear is that these institutions do not ask for information in this way. They're not going to ask you through an email to validate your information. I think it's also possible to look at the URL at the top of the email, and generally it would not have a secure setting, HTTPS. And in addition to that, it's really interesting sometimes as you read some of these emails, the grammar mistakes that are made gives you a tip-off of of some person from a foreign country who was trying to translate something into English, and it just doesn't sit right.
Exactly. The grammar, the spelling of things, the switching around of names that aren't consistent, all of those kinds of things indicate that if you were getting something, it looks legit because you have the icon from that particular company, but those are easy to get off of the internet. So it looks like it is a real thing, and that's what one of the problems is that our technology makes it look so legitimate. And it can be hidden. Everything is hidden under buttons and other things. That's very good with the URL to look at that as well.
It's the man behind the curtain.
Yeah, exactly.
So yep. Chris, talk to us about a time when you may have encountered one of these schemes.
Wow. So personally, I just encountered one a few weeks ago when you and I talked last, applying for some patents. As I applied through an attorney here in town, sent everything off to the government, I received this very odd, very official-looking thing from a center that I'd never heard of in the United States government that said I owed them more money than I had originally paid in order to have a logo patented or protected. And I just couldn't imagine that I would receive something like this, and so made a few phone calls, and absolutely, it was a complete scam that somebody just trolls the internet for who applies for patents or copyrights and sends these out arbitrarily, and you know they're successful. I think the one thing that I want to say, though, that is very important that we should always get up front whenever we talk about safety or concerns about safety, the world is wonderful, right, to live, to participate. The internet is an amazing tool, and we should never approach it from the standpoint of being paranoid. Right? What we're talking about is just reducing our risk, not paranoid and afraid and unable to use it or unable to go out or whatever the circumstances may be, but we're just going to reduce our risk a little bit. And so you don't need to be an expert because all the institutions that we talked about, credit cards and banks and the United States government, would all love to talk to you and have avenues that you can get a hold of them in order to confirm that you actually owe them some money. And so there's no reason to do it over the internet. There's so many different ways and there's so many different processes. It's right on the back of every credit card you have, that customer service number. I mean, it's very convenient. And so, again, we're not talking paranoid. It's how do I reduce my liability as I participate in society? And it's so important that good people participate. Because when we don't, again, it falls into that neighborhood where the criminals win. And they're controlling everything. But when we say no, then we absolutely have the control.
That's great advice. So let's talk about some of these techniques that we unwittingly may invite problems into our lives. I agree with you absolutely. Being proactive, being positive, utilizing the internet for all of the positive things, but with some prudence and with some understanding that there are ways in which these people operate. So there are some things, for example, in an airport, you may want to go online. And most of the internet and wireless access in an airport is not going to be secured. And so an individual has to think through what kind of information. If they're just going online to look at the news and send an email without confidential information, fine. But if they start doing banking, if they start doing any sort of financial transfer, personal information transfer, they need to be aware that they're leaving themselves open and vulnerable in an unsecured wireless service. What are some of the other things, Chris, that you think individuals just need to be aware of? We've talked about the phishing email, phishing with a PH. We've talked about unsecured wireless services. What are some other things that you would caution people just to be prudent about?
Well, as far as sharing any information, whether it's social networking sites, whether it's responding to emails or something that you may receive, if you would not want the public at large to know when you're vacationing, to know what your date of birth is, where you work, where you live, all those personal things that we hold close. If you don't want that shared with everybody, then don't post it online anywhere, because once you do, you lose control of it. So anytime you have an open access sort of thing, you want to be cautious of that. Even sending emails to friends, right, they can be forwarded. Now, again, that's not that you don't send emails, but you're just circumspect about what you put in there. unless it's to a very specific person and you know you have more control over that. That's the biggest thing that I see is the oversharing of information on public sites just because there's a dialogue taking place.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's secure.
And that goes for photos, too.
It does absolutely go for photos. And so there's lots of different things, and I'm certainly not the expert. Debbie can probably speak better to this as far as there's different services that are more private, right, that are not shared with everybody and replicated time and time again. And those are the ones that I would navigate or switch to.
So, Debbie, talk to us a little bit about some of the advice that you give relative to your students and in your personal life experience on watching for these different techniques.
Well, first, the one thing that Chris mentioned is to not using the free Wi-Fi, or be careful what you're using under free Wi-Fi, because that is one of those that you don't want to do anything that has your key passwords and information, and that even includes the free Wi-Fi, even though you have a password in like your hotel rooms, because think of the number of people that are within that network. That's part of the problem. But the next piece of it would be along the lines of your privacy and security settings, going in and making sure that within Facebook, within Amazon, within your browser settings, any of these particular, and your computers, any of those need to have your privacy and security settings put at a level that's comfortable for you. Some people have it set that it blasts out to everybody and they accept everything, and if that's comfortable to them, that's fine. But for most of us, I would set it not at the very most secure, but something that's in the middle, that kind of the balance kind of idea. Being able to access things, but yet keeping things secure, in the sense also of totally what Chris said, is to really realize what you're posting, because once it's out there, it is out there. If you wouldn't have done it without technology, meaning you wouldn't have sent out and taken an ad in the newspaper or put it out in some other form that you're going on vacation, don't put it on the internet. If you want to share pictures, do it afterwards, but not while you're gone.
Well, and the thing I think is important is people think that this is a problem with age or it's very young people. No, it's everybody. And the classics, I was sitting in a room full of police chiefs, and I won't give up any of their names, but about 100 across the nation. And an FBI agent was demonstrating how easy it was to do just this on the hotel Wi-Fi. And he started to pull up emails and texts from around the room that were happening then. I've never seen so many people shutting their phone off as quickly as they could. So we're all susceptible to this. And so it's not, the stigma should be erased, because any one of us can be. And so sharing that information, again, is the way that we control this problem going into the future.
So there are some things that tend to make older adults vulnerable, particularly for financial fraud and financial exploitation. And we know that the trend is increasing for people over age 65. I indicated earlier, it's our generation was the first one to go entirely online. And we have now over 60% of the population reporting over age 65 that they are active on the internet, and 56% have a Facebook presence or some other social media presence. So, Deb, share, if you will, any horror stories you might have heard related to people, older individuals, who have been a victim of a circumstance on the internet.
Well, one of the worst that I have personally heard was a person in one of my classes this last year who someone gave a call and indicated that there was a problem with their computer and said, "Can I get on your computer?" and which is called remote access. And they gave them permission to get on, this stranger that indicated something was wrong with their machine. And they got onto their machine, accessed passwords, was able to get into their bank account via their computer, because they were now controlling the computer, cleaned the person out of the $10,000 within their account. When this person realized what had happened, it was too late, it was untraceable, and she learned the hard way. And it's one of those things that if there's a problem with your computer and someone's calling you up, if someone came to your door and said, "There's a problem with your TV, would you let them in the door?" and look at your TV. You don't want to do that with your computer either. Let anybody you don't know access your computer from somewhere else.
I was going to say that I must get 3 or 4 phone calls a week on the warranty that's expired that I never had, or that my Windows system is crashing that I happen to be using at the time just fine, and wanting to invite themselves into your system like that, and it's incredibly common. Older adults tend to have a lot of assets. They tend to be trusting. They tend to have the grandkids, and they have the emotional pull on some of these schemes. One of the sobering things about the behavior, though, of fraud is that if you have been defrauded once, the likelihood of it happening again is very, very high. And people need to understand that they may be vulnerable. They're a type A personality. There are things that may trigger them. I have to laugh, Chris, when you talked about the room full of police chiefs, how quickly that sends a message home. Could you think of any other stories that have impacted you, or someone that might have had a so-called horror story?
Too many, unfortunately, to really dial in. I mean, I had a woman who reported to the police department that she owned a home in a different state and had utilities, and she'd never been to that state before in her life, and would like the police department to help. Well, I had no jurisdiction, right? I didn't, it's a remote state. Now, amplify that in certain circumstances where it's happening in another country, right, where fraud, right, is bouncing off of several different countries before it gets into the U.S.
Right.
It becomes almost impossible from a law enforcement perspective to turn that around and correct that. And so the best way to deal with this is avoidance in the first place. But because once you wander down that road, it's very hard to bring those things back. And I'm sure this woman is still trying to recover from the impact of these people defaulting under her name on all their services, their home mortgage, and everything else. And the reason that she found out about it is she was applying to get an apartment.
Interesting. And that shows up in credit reports.
No, it does. Yes. And then all of a sudden, she knows nothing about this. Right. And so check those things. Again, not paranoid, but just a little.
Vigilant.
Yes. Paying attention to what's going on and what might be accessing you. You mentioned computer things. I can't, depending on what site you go on, it's become so intelligent as far as, the research and everything. You get all sorts of ads that say, oh, buy this because you've purchased that in the past. Well, that's the same thing. If you bought into a scam in the past, you are more likely
get more
to have the scammers send you more.
Right.
And so those are the types of things that you just need to be aware of.
Absolutely. I could think of 3 years ago, we filed our tax returns, my wife and I. And we got a note back from the IRS, or the TurboTax is where we're filing. It says, you've already filed your returns. Well, we hadn't, but somebody had. And so
did they pay the bill is the question.
They happened to pick a year where we owed money, and so there was no refund. But what that does is sets in place a series of things, and we were able to get that untangled. But then you have to put passwords on your accounts, your bank accounts, and that just layer up the security to make sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen again. And it wasn't anything that we knew that we had done, but there are pieces of information that are out there, as you say. Once it's a Social Security number or anything else, it's like the passport to your life. And if somebody gets access to that, then no good can come from that.
It should be very limited on who you would share that information with over any device or even in person.
And to that point, that's why Medicare finally, CMS, has issued new Medicare cards for everybody where they have finally removed the Social Security number off that medical ID card for individuals who are older than 65. You're listening to the Rap on Aging podcast from Scope Radio. I'm your host, Rob Ence, with the Utah Commission on Aging. And today we are talking about Internet and technology security. Our guests are Debbie White, an Internet security educator, and Chris Burbank, a law enforcement expert. If you have any questions about this issue or suggestions on topics you'd like to talk to us about, please send us an email to utahaging@gmail.com, and be sure to check out our website at www.ucoa.utah.edu. And follow us on Facebook. There's a great scene in the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. And it was after one of their boxcar blow-ups to get to the money in the vault. And as they're going off, they realize they're now being followed by a group of professionals. I think Joe LaFleur, the guy in the white hat. And this scene goes on for a while, and they just keep asking each other, who are those guys? And finally, Paul Newman says in a scene, they're beginning to get on my nerves. Who are those guys? So let's talk a little bit about who are the individuals that exploit us. Now, generally, in fraudulent exploitation of older adults, oftentimes there's what we call affinity fraud, people you know. People that can be in a family or a church, and that's not the focus of our conversation today, because the invisible perpetrators of the internet fraud are not necessarily people you're going to know. Likely you're not going to know. Talk to us a little bit about who are these individuals and where do they come from? Who exploits us?
Well, the one thing that we know for certain is they have been successful in the past. Very few of these individuals are first-timers. Right? They have been successful in this avenue. It's worked for them, and they're willing to try it again. And part of the reason that I think we've seen a decline in some crime, some persons' crimes, is because it's now moved to the internet, because the perpetrators of this crime feel safe. They're at a distance. Many, many times they're from outside the country. Oftentimes they're not even in the same state in which they're perpetrating the crime, because they feel a sense of security from that. And so these are distant individuals, so you can't reach out and touch them. And they are often people that have no idea, right? They are just looking at histories, which are readily available on the internet, what you are doing, what you're participating in, who you're banking with, those types of things. And that's who they get a list of people and they send out to everybody. And what we know from statistics is they are successful in a certain percentage of that. And they are successful enough that this is a problem. And so it's hard to say this is exactly what they look like, but I would dare say it doesn't matter as much in this particular circumstance, because knowing who they are or what they look like is not going to protect you from this. Knowing what the scam is and how to protect ourselves is really the avenue that we want to take.
And I think that is the point, and I'm glad that you made that. Because they're invisible, because they could be from another country. They could be sitting in a boiler room somewhere, a group of people on the phone, or it could be an individual like this young man we talked about earlier in the program who started at age 13 pulling cons and ideas. Or it's the great Frank Abagnale story from Catch Me If You Can. They try something, it works, and they try it again and again, and pretty soon the numbers get larger. So you've indicated why this is hard to manage, Chris. We talk a little bit about the fact that we don't know who they are. What are some of the other challenges for law enforcement in dealing with this?
The biggest challenge is it's underreported. People do not want to call the police and say, hey, I lost $150. I lost $500. They are very hesitant because they are embarrassed many times. It appears that they can't manage themselves or their money well. And so why do you want to report that to everybody? And so it is an underreported crime. And so when you look at an individual who's perpetrating this crime and they are successful and it's not reported, there's no avenue to stop them from doing that the next 10, 20 times. And so one of the things is stand up and let people know what's going on. Report to law enforcement. Now, right up front, I don't know that you'll be satisfied. This is the biggest challenge that I think we face in law enforcement today, is the fact that this interagency, there's not, whose jurisdiction is this? And it kind of touches a whole bunch of different things, and it gets passed around. And when it's a state-to-state thing or a city-to-city thing, it's like, well, is the crime occurring where the person is making the call, or is the crime occurring where the actual fraud is taking place? And so then it becomes a jurisdictional battle that we're not well equipped for. But at least getting it out there. The other thing that I think is very important, and where I have found some of my greatest satisfaction when I've encountered problems like this, is the credit card companies or the banks. They do not want their name being used that way or being associated with this. And if you have a question and you call up any one of the major credit card companies and say, hey, this is what's going on in your name, you'd be amazed at the action and response you will get from them, because they're going to go out and do all they can within their power to seek out and stop this and the perpetration in their name. And so that's been very successful. And again, I'm not saying that police can't handle it, but boy, it's a challenging thing for us.
So because it is difficult and there are jurisdictional issues, we're not in any way discouraging people from reporting. Where do people report this information?
Well, I think the two that we identified is, local law enforcement. You're going to call up your local law enforcement agency, and you don't even necessarily have to have an officer come out because there's very little evidence, per se, that they can gather or gain. But just say, this is what I'm experiencing. And a lot of law enforcement agencies now have an avenue that you can send them in, the email or the text or whatever it is that you received or which fraud. And even if you're not, right, if you let local law enforcement know, hey, I received this, I think it's a scam, right, deal with it. I've seen very effective proactive work where they've published in the community, hey, somebody is sending this email out, and they put it on the 10 o'clock news. Don't respond to it. Those are the types of things that, again, drive criminals away, especially from a communicating network of people in a city or a state.
So you've uncovered, the scam, and you've made it visible. I think that we have the opportunity to report some things to the Attorney General's office for certain kinds of crimes. There are consumer protection agencies that like to know, even though they may not be able to resolve the problem, they certainly can help promote and talk about and help other people, be prevented from participating in it. AERP, for example, has a Fraud Watch network where they also will share ideas, will share information where other people have been defrauded. So we will post all of those different resources on our website so individuals know where they can report those things.
And definitely your bank, your credit card company, because every single one of those institutions has some sort of consumer protection. So
Absolutely.
Let them know as well.
Yep. So, Deb, I'm sure that when you've had conversations again with your students, that there is a bit of a self-assessment you walk them through and questions that people should be asking themselves. I've always been amazed at someone who said, I just won the lottery. And, well, did you even join the lottery? Did you even apply for it? How can you win something you never applied for? And do people understand that if there ever is a legitimate winning for anything, you're not going to pay money up front to collect what's due you or pay up front on the taxes? Could you share some of the things that you talk to your classes about in terms of helping them be self-aware?
Well, basically what I talk to them about is taking a minute to just breathe in the first place. When they get one of those type of emails or those notifications on the phone, and you're right, if they didn't enter the lottery, how can they win it? If they have an inheritance from someone they don't know, you're not going to be contacted by somebody in a manner of on the phone. You are usually going to get some sort of certified letter and so on. And a scammer is not going to do a certified letter type thing. So it's one of those as to thinking logically about it in the first place. And it would be also the idea of things such as when you're meeting someone. Some of the biggest scams that I've uncovered have been where people are doing meetups and the online dating, and someone wants them to send them $5,000. I know of someone who personally borrowed 2 times $5,000 to send to somebody that she didn't know, and then wondered why that person never connected with her. And it's one of those things that we need to really think out rationally, in the sense of, would this person really be talking to me if they didn't need money? Or would this person that left me money, would a lawyer be contacting me? It's one of those things that we need to think from that perspective. It's just sitting down with common sense that way.
So we said earlier in the program, you've really got nothing to hide but everything to protect. So let's just do a reprise of some of the key things that we've encouraged people to do. How do we engage with confidence when we interface with technology of today and tomorrow? Chris?
So I think my 2 recommendations would be, 1, get some education. It sounds like Debbie does some great classes. A little bit of education goes a long way. But then the fact is, have confidence in this. Right? If it looks bad, it's bad, right? And anybody who's trying to get a hold of you on the phone who leaves you a message that you don't know, if it's important, you'll definitely get a call back from them. Our liability is not tremendous here. And the nice thing is, even the federal government, when you talk to the IRS, which most people go, well, what if it's the IRS? Well, the IRS will send a second letter for sure. And not only that, there are avenues to contact them all the time. And so don't be taken in by the urgency. That's really what it falls down to, is be confident that the urgency doesn't exist. And no one, if they want to give you $500,000, is not going to hold it for a week or two more.
Deb made an interesting comment a moment ago, getting people to just take a breath. We get this desire for impulsive response. Something comes up on our iPhone. Is this you? Or open this too. And then the minute you click on that, you just open that portal for somebody. But we had no business doing that because we didn't know who it was, what it was.
That's why they put all the goodies in the supermarket right at the checkout line. It's no different, right?
Yeah.
And they're playing on that exact same physiological response that you have when you stand in line and you see the candy bar right there that, oh, that looks so good. I can just throw that in the basket and be off my way. No, they know.
Sweet satisfaction. So lots of prevention through public education and repetition. We can't hear this enough because we have a tendency, after all we've heard, we still ponder, is it possible it's true? Is it possible it's real? And we just have to give ourselves the space to evaluate it and make sure that there are legitimate ways to check things. Deb, again, back to your education efforts. There are some things you certainly are having your students do on a regular basis relative to passwords and so on. Talk a little bit about that. What are the tips you would leave with them?
Passwords are really something that are quite important, that when I help different people out, they oftentimes have something as simple as their dog's name, Mitzi, or they put in something as to their phone number, something that's easy to remember. And it's important that you have a password that's easy to remember. At the same time, you need to have for your bank accounts, your credit card, and any home network, something that's quite complicated. It needs to be at least 8 characters long, capitals and lowercase, numbers and symbols. And you can have some really unique things, such as like combining things that don't combine. Like one example I saw was Chewbacca and pizza mixed around with numbers. Now, if you like Chewbacca and you like pizza and you've got a few numbers in there, no one is going to come up with the idea that your main password is a combination of that. It's something that needs to be complicated enough that you write it down, but you don't have it sitting right next to your computer as well. You have it put in a safe place, such as a fireproof safe, where you can go back and get to it if you want to. If you've got information that is just general, like you go to a craft site or something else that has no credit card information or personal information, and you're just using it to get in, you don't need anything complicated, but you do for your bank accounts, and it's something that is very important that way, to make it so that it is not easy to come up with somebody.
Thanks for those great tips. Chris mentioned a moment ago how important it was for us to check our credit reports and to check our bank account statements regularly. And to do that most effectively is online. I would never encourage anybody in today's age to still be writing checks and doing things that have your bank account number on it and your signature on it. But to do it online safely, you have to abide by the protocols that will protect you and trust those sources that are your financial institutions that you've indicated, Chris. Last word. Anything else you'd like to add, Chris?
Only to reiterate, because I am always afraid when you stand up and say, boy, there's danger out there, that people run from it. We want to be informed, not paranoid, and make wise decisions to reduce our risk. We won't ever eliminate it in this world, but we absolutely can reduce it by making smart decisions and choices.
Thank you. Deb, last thoughts.
Yes. And balance. Just like Chris is saying, it's a balance. You have to determine what out there is important for you to save, as well as the convenience of what technology does for us. And if you put some things in place that will help you, then you can feel a lot more comfortable with the kinds of things that you do online. If you don't click on something you don't know, don't open up something that you don't know, make sure your passwords are there, make sure that maybe two-step authentication, or your notifications are on for your credit cards. Those basic, simple things will help you to be much more comfortable online when you are online.
Well, thank you, Deb. Thank you, Chris. I think this discussion has been very helpful to our listening audience, and we thank you for listening. If you have any questions about this issue or suggestions on topics you'd like us to talk about, please send us an email to utahaging@gmail.com. Remember to check out our website and other podcasts at www.ucoa.utah.edu and follow us on Facebook. I'm Rob Ence, Executive Director of the Utah Commission on Aging, and this has been The Wrap on Aging.